The lockbox on my parents' front door beeped, and I typed in the code myself. My hand was steady, my heart wasn't. I pushed the door open and stepped into the house I grew up in, the house they told me I'd never set foot in again, and I heard my mother's voice from the kitchen asking who was there. "It's Emily," I said, and I watched her drop a coffee mug on the tile floor. My father came around the corner with his reading glasses still on, holding a stack of unopened mail, and when he saw me his face went the color of old paper. "You need to leave," he said, the way he'd said it 7 years ago on this exact same porch. I held up the folder in my hand instead of answering him. Inside it was a deed, a closing statement, and a single sheet of paper with my name printed at the top under the words "new legal owner." "I'm not going anywhere, Dad," I said quietly. "This is my house now." Neither of them moved. My mother's hand was pressed flat against her chest like she was trying to keep something inside her from spilling out. "You bought our house," my father said, not as a question, more like he was testing whether the words would even come out right. "I bought it at auction 3 weeks ago," I said, "under a company name so nobody would know it was me." "You've been paying rent to me for 11 days and you didn't even know it." To understand how we got to that kitchen, to that silence, to that moment where the two people who raised me stood frozen in front of the daughter they'd erased, you have to go back 7 years, to the night they told me I wasn't welcome at Thanksgiving anymore. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life I was the Carter family's biggest disappointment. At least according to my parents. My younger brother Tyler was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, the one my father bragged about at the barber shop and my mother bragged about at church. Even when Tyler's choices left a trail of debt and broken promises behind him, I was the quiet one, the responsible one, the one who paid her own way through community college and then a state university while working 2 jobs, and somehow that made me the villain in my own family's story. It started small, the way these things always do, with my parents quietly covering Tyler's car payments, then his rent, then a business loan for a food truck that never once served a single customer. When I asked, gently at a Sunday dinner, whether it was fair that I'd never once gotten help like that, my father set his fork down and told me I was jealous of my own brother's ambition. That comment sat in my chest for months, a splinter I couldn't dig out, but I stayed quiet because that's what I'd always done to keep the peace. The real break came the year I turned 27, when Tyler asked our parents to co-sign a loan for a used car dealership he wanted to open, and I made the mistake of saying out loud that maybe they should ask him to show a business plan first. My mother called it betrayal, my father called it jealousy dressed up as concern, Tyler called it sabotage, and cried real tears doing it, which I found out years later he'd practiced saying to me before he even walked into that room. That Thanksgiving, my father stood up at the table and told me that if I couldn't support my brother, I could find somewhere else to spend the holidays, and my mother didn't say a single word to stop him. I remember the drive home that night more clearly than almost anything else in my life, the wet roads, the heater blowing too loud, my hands shaking on the wheel the entire way. For the first year after that, I kept waiting for a phone call that never came. I checked my phone at every red light like it might ring with an apology. It didn't. Instead, I got occasional updates through my cousin Denise, who still talked to my mother, and every update was about how well Tyler's dealership was doing, how proud my parents were, how they'd taken out a second mortgage to help him expand into a second lot. I told myself I didn't care anymore, and some days that was even true. I threw myself into work instead, first as a junior analyst at a regional bank, then in commercial real estate underwriting, learning things about mortgages and liens and foreclosure law that most people never think about until it's too late. My manager at the time, a sharp, soft-spoken woman named Priya Nathan, became something like the mentor I never had at home, teaching me not just numbers but patience, the kind of patience that waits and watches instead of reacting. "People show you who they are through their paperwork," she told me once, tapping a stack of loan documents on her desk, "long before they show you through their words." I didn't know yet how true that would turn out to be for my own family. 5 years passed like that. Me building a life brick by brick, no help from anyone, buying a small townhouse on the edge of the city, getting promoted twice, learning to be proud of a version of myself nobody in my family had ever bothered to notice. There were harder moments in those 5 years than I usually let myself admit. The first Christmas alone, sitting in my apartment eating takeout in front of a television I wasn't really watching, wondering if I'd made some unforgivable mistake by simply asking a fair question at a dinner table. I dated a man named Chris for almost 2 years during that stretch, a contractor with a steady laugh and an easy way about him, and he was the one who finally asked me, gently, over dinner one night, why I never talked about my family. There's nothing to talk about, I told him, which was, of course, a lie, the kind of lie you tell so often you almost start believing it yourself. He didn't push. Not that night, but a few months later, after meeting Denise at a mutual friend's wedding and hearing just enough to piece together the outline of what had happened, he sat me down and told me something I never forgot. You talk about your job like it's the only place you're allowed to be proud of yourself, he said. That's not normal, that's A1 talking. We didn't stay together in the end. Not because of anything dramatic, just two people who wanted different things out of life. But that conversation stuck with me long after he was gone, a quiet splinter of truth I kept turning over during slow nights at my desk. I started seeing a therapist not long after that relationship ended, a woman named Dr. Alvarez who specialized in estrangement and family systems, and for the first time I said out loud, to another human being, that I thought my parents loved my brother more than they loved me. That might be true, she told me, not unkindly, and it might also be true that they never learned how to love anyone the right way at all. Sometimes those two things look the same from the outside, but they feel very different once you understand them. That single sentence did more for me than years of silently blaming myself ever had. Then, on a Tuesday in March, Denise called me, and I almost didn't pick up because we hadn't spoken in almost a year. I don't know if I should be telling you this, she said, her voice tight, but I think you'd want to know. Your parents' house is in trouble. My stomach dropped in a way I wasn't expecting, considering everything. What kind of trouble? Foreclosure trouble, she said. I heard it from my mom, who heard it from your mom, who was crying about it at church. I sat with that for a long moment, staring at my own reflection in my dark laptop screen, feeling something complicated stir in my chest that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite grief either. How does that even happen? I asked. They owned that house outright. They paid it off before I even left for college, Tyler, Denise said, like that one word explained everything, and in a way, it did. Over the next few days I couldn't stop thinking about it, turning it over the way I used to turn over loan files at work, looking for the crack in the numbers that told the real story underneath the surface one. I told myself I was just curious, professionally curious, the same way I'd look up any distressed property, except I knew that was a lie the moment I opened the county recorder's website and typed in my parents' address with trembling fingers. What I found stopped me cold. There wasn't just one mortgage on that house, there were two. The second one taken out 14 months earlier for an amount that made my throat tighten, $190,000, against a home that used to be completely free and clear. The lender was a private commercial lender, not a bank, the kind that specializes in loans to people who can't get approved anywhere else, the kind that charges interest rates that eat a family alive slowly instead of all at once. I sat back in my chair and stared at the ceiling of my apartment for a long time, thinking about my father, telling me I could find somewhere else to spend Thanksgiving, thinking about how he'd probably signed that loan with the same confident, dismissive hand. 2 weeks later, another piece fell into place when my old coworker James, who now worked at the same title company that had handled that second mortgage, mentioned over coffee that the file had crossed his desk and that something about it had seemed off to him at the time. The signatures didn't quite match the old file, he said, shrugging like it was nothing. Happens sometimes. People's handwriting changes with age. Nobody flagged it. I didn't say anything, but a cold, careful part of my brain, the part Priya had trained in me over years of underwriting fraud cases, filed that detail away like a photograph. That night, I couldn't sleep, so I pulled every public record I could find on the second lender, a company called Ashcroft Bridge Capital, and the deeper I dug, the stranger the picture became. Ashcroft Bridge Capital had no real office, just a mailing address that turned out to belong to a upstore 2 towns over from my parents, and its listed manager on the state filings was a name I didn't recognize at all, someone called Marcus Doyle. On a hunch, I searched that name alongside Tyler's old dealership, and there it was, buried in an old local business directory. Marcus Doyle listed as a silent financing partner for Tyler's used car lot 2 years earlier. My stomach turned over slowly, the way it does when a puzzle you've been avoiding suddenly starts assembling itself whether you want it to or not. It wasn't proof of anything yet, not in any legal sense, but it was enough of a thread that I knew I couldn't just leave it alone and pretend I hadn't seen it. A month after that, I got a call, completely unrelated, that I almost didn't take seriously, from a foreclosure trustee's office letting me know, as a courtesy since I'd once inquired about the file professionally, that the property was headed to public auction in 6 weeks. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen for almost an hour without moving. Some part of me wanted to feel nothing, some part of me wanted to feel joy, the ugly kind, the kind that whispered they deserve this, and some part of me, the part that scared me most, wanted to call my mother and warn her. I didn't call. Instead, I called Priya, who by then had left the bank and started her own small real estate investment firm, and I asked her a question I never thought I'd ask anyone. If I wanted to buy a property at foreclosure auction, I said, keeping my voice level, completely anonymously through a company, no personal name attached anywhere. How would I do that? There was a pause on the line long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Emily, she said carefully, whose house are we talking about? I told her everything then. All of it. 7 years of silence poured out over one phone call, and when I finished, she didn't say anything for a moment. You don't have to decide today, she finally said, but if you do this, you do it for the right reasons. Not to hurt them, because if you do it to hurt them, it'll hurt you just as much in the end. I told her I understood. I'm not sure, looking back, that I actually did. Over the following weeks I formed a small LLC, something bland and forgettable sounding, Meridian Home Holdings, and I quietly moved the savings I'd built over a decade of discipline into a fund set aside for exactly this kind of opportunity. I told myself this was strategy, not revenge. I told myself this a lot, but every night, before I fell asleep, I kept picturing my father's face the day he told me to leave, and some nights that picture felt less like a wound and more like fuel. 3 days before the auction, Denise called again, this time crying. They're going to lose the house. She said, my mom said your mom hasn't slept in a week. Tyler won't even answer their calls anymore. What do you mean he won't answer? I asked, sitting up straighter. I mean he's disappeared, she said. Nobody's heard from him in almost a month. The dealership's gone to repossessed. All of it. Something in that detail didn't sit right with me. The timing, the silence, the way Tyler had a talent his whole life for vanishing right when things got difficult for everyone but him. I spent that night going back through the county records one more time, this time with a different question in mind. Not what happened, but who actually signed for it. At 2 in the morning, I found something that made my hands go cold. The notarization on the second mortgage listed a notary public whose license, according to the state's public database, had expired 8 months before the document was signed. That wasn't a small mistake. That was the kind of detail that unravels an entire loan file if the right person goes looking. I printed everything, every page, every date, every signature, and I laid it all out across my kitchen table like a crime scene, because in a quiet, bloodless way, that's exactly what it was. The morning of the auction, I sat in my car outside the county courthouse steps for 20 minutes before I could make myself walk inside, my folder tucked under my arm, my heart pounding harder than it had at any job interview I'd ever had. There were only 6 other bidders there, mostly investors I recognized from other auctions, men in polo shirts checking their phones, treating my childhood home like a line item. When the auctioneer called the address, my stomach lurched so hard I thought I might be sick right there on the courthouse steps. I raised my paddle. Somebody else raised theirs. I raised it again. My voice, when I finally had to speak the number out loud, came out steadier than I felt. Sold, the auctioneer said, to bidder number 4, Meridian Home Holdings. Just like that, the house I grew up in, the house I wasn't allowed to walk into for 7 years, belonged to me. One of the other investors, A heavy-set man in a golf polo who'd bid against me until the very end, walked over afterward and asked, half joking, whether I had some kind of personal connection to that address, since I'd bid well past what the numbers reasonably justified, something like that. I told him, and left it there, because I wasn't ready yet to explain to a stranger on courthouse steps something I could barely explain to myself. I sat in the parking lot afterward for almost 45 minutes, closing statement in hand, watching other people's ordinary Tuesday unfold around me, wondering if I'd just done something brave or something I'd regret for the rest of my life. Priya called that evening to check on me, and when I told her it was done, she was quiet for a second before she spoke. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Empty," I admitted. "I thought I'd feel something bigger than this." "That's normal," she said. "The buying is never the hard part, Emily. It's what you decide to do with it next that actually matters." I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. I just stood there for a moment feeling strangely, terribly hollow, like I'd been building toward this moment for so long that I'd forgotten to plan for what came after it for 11 days. I let the property management side of things run itself quietly through Meridian, a standard notice mailed to the residents about a change in ownership, nothing with my name on it, nothing that would tip them off. I told myself I was giving myself time to think about what to do next. Really, I think I was giving myself time to get brave enough to walk through that door on the 12th day. I couldn't wait anymore. I drove to the house I hadn't seen in 7 years, sat outside it in my car for a long time watching my mother's silhouette move behind the kitchen curtains, and then I finally walked up to the door and let myself in. Which brings us back to that kitchen. My mother's shattered coffee mug on the floor, my father's face gone pale, both of them staring at me like I was something that had crawled up out of the past to haunt them. "You need to leave," my father said again, out of pure instinct, before his brain seemed to catch up with what I just told him. "I don't," I said. "This is legally my property. I have the closing documents right here if you want to see them." Before she could say more, my father's phone rang on the counter, an unfamiliar number, and out of pure habit he answered it, putting it on speaker without thinking. "Mr. Carter, this is First Union Credit regarding your business line of credit," a voice said briskly. "We're calling about a missed payment linked to a used vehicle inventory loan." My father's face went slack. "We don't have a business line of credit," he said slowly, more to himself than to the person on the phone. "According to our records, sir, this account was opened 18 months ago, co-signed under your name," the voice continued. Oblivious to the storm it was causing in that kitchen, my father hung up without another word, setting the phone down on the counter like it had burned him, and for a long moment none of us said anything at all. My mother finally found her voice, and it came out cracked and small. "Why would you do this to us?" "I didn't do anything to you," I said. "I bought a house at a public auction. You're the ones who took out a loan you couldn't pay against a house you already owned. That loan was for your brother," my father said. Like that explained everything. Like it always had. "I know," I said. "I found the paperwork, all of it." Something flickered across my father's face then, something I hadn't seen from him in years, something close to fear. "What do you mean, all of it?" he asked slowly. I set my folder down on the kitchen counter, the same counter where I used to do my homework as a kid while my mother made dinner, and I opened it to the page with the expired notary stamp circled in red. "I mean the notarization on your second mortgage was fraudulent," I said. "Whoever signed for that loan, it wasn't done legally. And I don't think it was you who signed it, Dad. I think it was Tyler." The silence in that kitchen was so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming. "That's not possible," my mother whispered. But her eyes had gone somewhere far away, somewhere that told me part of her had already suspected it. "Where is he right now?" I asked gently. Denise said nobody's heard from him in a month. My father sat down hard in one of the kitchen chairs, the same chairs we'd all sat in the night he told me to leave, and for the first time in my entire life, I watched him look genuinely lost. "He said he needed us to sign some refinancing paperwork," my father said slowly, like he was working through it out loud for the first time. "He said it would help with the dealership. He brought a notary with him, a friend of his. We trusted him." "Did you read what you signed?" I asked, and I already knew the answer before he shook his head. "He's our son," my mother said, and there were tears running freely down her face now. "We trusted him the way we trust family." I felt something twist painfully in my chest at that word, family, the same word that had been used 7 years ago to cut me out of every holiday, every phone call, every ordinary Sunday dinner, while it was apparently never once used to hold Tyler accountable for anything. You trusted him the way you never trusted me, I said quietly. And I watched that land on both of them like a physical blow. My mother opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, because there wasn't really anything to say to that, and we all knew it. There's something else, I said, and I pulled out the second sheet from my folder, the printout linking Ashcroft Bridge Capital to a man named Marcus Doyle, and beneath it, a screenshot Denise had helped me find, an old photo from Tyler's dealership grand opening with that same man standing beside him, arms slung over his shoulder, like an old friend. My father took the paper with shaking hands, squinting at the photo like it might rearrange itself into something less damning if he looked long enough. He's had this financing partner the entire time, I said, the same year he asked you to co-sign the dealership loan. He was already borrowing money from someone else behind your back. I think when that first arrangement started going bad, he needed a way to cover it, and your house was the easiest thing left standing. That doesn't mean he forged anything, my father said, but his voice had lost its conviction, like a man arguing against something he already believed. No, I agreed. But an expired notary license and a financing partner he never told you about is enough for someone to start asking real questions. I already made a call this morning. My mother's face went white. What kind of call? The kind that involves a fraud investigator. I said gently. I didn't do it to hurt him. I did it because somebody needed to finally ask the questions nobody in this family was ever willing to ask. I want to be honest with you here, because I promised myself this story wouldn't be one-sided even about my own family. Standing in that kitchen, watching my parents crumble under the weight of a truth they'd been avoiding for years, I did not feel powerful. I felt sick. Be honest. Would you have felt satisfaction in that moment? Or would you have felt exactly what I did, something closer to grief for the family you never actually had? I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments, because I still don't fully know the answer myself. That night, I didn't stay at the house. I drove home in silence, and when I got there, I sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, the same way I used to sit as a kid when I needed to feel small and unseen. For a while, I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about Tyler, about a decade of him being handed everything while I built my life out of scraps and stubbornness, and about the sick, quiet realization that even in his absence, he was still the reason our whole family was falling apart. The next morning, I called a contact I still had from my banking days, a fraud investigator named Marcus Webb who now worked with the county on financial crimes involving elder exploitation, and I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, the way good investigators do, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. This isn't just a civil issue anymore, he said. If what you're describing is accurate, forging a notarization on a loan against your parents' primary residence, that's fraud, and depending on how the funds were used, it could be a whole lot worse. What happens now? I asked. Now, he said, we find your brother. It took the investigators team 11 days to track Tyler down, holed up in a rented condo 3 states away under a name that was almost his but not quite, living off the last of the dealership loan money while our parents faced losing the roof over their heads. The sheriff's department in that county picked him up on a Thursday afternoon. Denise called me the second she heard, breathless, like she couldn't decide whether to be relieved or devastated. They arrested him, she said. Fraud, forgery, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, because of mom's health stuff. This is bad. I sat with the news for a long time after we hung up. And I want to tell you I felt triumphant, the kind of clean, satisfying justice you see in the movies. But the truth is more complicated than that. I felt sad for my parents, who'd spent their whole lives protecting the wrong child, sad for Tyler, who I still believe, somewhere underneath all his choices, wasn't purely evil, just endlessly, catastrophically weak in a way nobody ever made him face until now, and sad for myself, for the years I'd spent believing I was the problem in this family, when the truth had been sitting in a folder of legal documents the whole time. My mother called me 2 days after Tyler's arrest, the first time she'd called me in 7 years, and when I saw her name on my screen, I had to sit down before I could answer it. "I don't know how to say this," she said, her voice raw from crying. "I don't know how to apologize for something this big. You don't have to figure it out all at once," I told her, surprising myself with how gently the words came out. "Your father blamed you," she said. "All those years, he blamed you for questioning Tyler, and I let him, because it was easier than admitting we'd built our whole family around protecting the wrong things." I didn't say anything for a long moment, because there was a version of me, the 7 years younger version, standing on that porch, who desperately wanted to hear those words, and there was a version of me now who wasn't sure they were enough anymore. "I'm not saying this to get anything from you," my mother continued. "I know we don't deserve anything from you. I just needed you to know that I know." She told me something else on that call too, something I hadn't expected, that she'd started seeing a counselor of her own that same week, not to fix anything with me specifically, but to understand why she'd let fear of losing Tyler outweigh everything else for so long. "I kept thinking if I pushed him too hard he'd disappear on us completely," she admitted, "so I stopped pushing him at all. And I let that same fear make me push you away instead, because you were the one who could survive it." I sat with that sentence for a long time after we hung up, turning it over, because it was the first time anyone in my family had ever put words to the quiet, unfair logic that had shaped my entire childhood, that my strength had somehow been used against me instead of for me. That, more than anything, more than the deed in my folder or the fraud case against my brother, was the moment I felt something in my chest finally loosen, just slightly, for the first time in years. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted completely, and then had to decide what forgiveness, if any, was even supposed to look like afterward? I'd really love to hear your story in the comments, because I think more of us carry this than we ever say out loud. I didn't make any promises to my mother on that call. I told her I needed time, and to her credit, she didn't push. She just said okay, and thank you for answering, and I love you, before she hung up. Over the following weeks, the legal situation slowly untangled itself because the second mortgage was proven fraudulent. The lien against the original title was voided entirely once the fraud was documented, which meant, in a strange twist of legal logic, that the house had technically never been validly encumbered in the way the foreclosure process assumed. My attorney, a careful, thorough woman named Rosalind Cho, who Priya had recommended to me, explained it in plain terms one afternoon over coffee. "Legally, you own the property free and clear," she said. "The auction was valid because the lien was valid on paper at the time, but morally, and honestly, practically, Emily, you're going to have to decide what kind of person you want to be with that ownership." I thought about that phrase 4 days afterward. What kind of person I wanted to be with it. I could have evicted my parents legally. I had every right to. Some petty, wounded part of me even considered it. Imagined the satisfaction of finally holding real power over the people who'd once held all of it over me. But I kept thinking about my mother's voice on that phone call and about Priya's warning, the one about doing this for the right reasons instead of the wrong ones, and I realized eviction wasn't justice, it was just a different flavor of cruelty, and I didn't want to become the thing that had hurt me. So instead, I did something that surprised even myself. I drew up a lease agreement through Meridian, fair market rent, nothing discounted, nothing charitable, with an option to purchase the home back from me over 10 years at a locked-in price, using the rent they paid as a credit toward that purchase. I brought the paperwork to the house myself on a Sunday afternoon and laid it out on that same kitchen counter where I'd first shown them the deed. "This isn't a gift," I told them both. "I'm not doing this out of pity, and I'm not doing this to make myself feel better about the last 7 years. I'm doing it because I think everyone deserves a real chance to make things right, if they're willing to actually do the work." My father, who hadn't said much of anything since the day I walked back into that house, finally looked up at me with an expression I'd never once seen on his face in 34 years. "Why would you do this for us?" he asked. "After everything we did to you?" "Because I'm not you," I said. Not unkindly, just honestly, I don't need to punish someone to know my own worth anymore. I spent 7 years figuring that out on my own, and I'm not giving that back just because you finally noticed me. He nodded slowly, and for the first time in my entire life, my father cried in front of me, quiet. Embarrassed tears he wiped away fast with the back of his hand, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to have them. They signed the lease that afternoon. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, it was something slower and more honest than that, a long road with real terms and real accountability on both sides. Instead of a single dramatic moment that fixed everything, Tyler eventually took a plea deal, a restitution, a probation, and a felony record that will follow him for the rest of his life, a consequence that was entirely his own to carry, built from choices no one else made for him. In the weeks between his arrest and his plea deal, I learned something else through Marcus Webb's investigation that none of us had seen coming, a detail that reframed even the years before the fraud. Back to the dealership itself, the original loan for the used car lot, the one my parents had proudly co-signed years earlier while telling me I was jealous for asking questions, had never actually gone entirely toward the business the way everyone assumed. Bank records showed nearly $40,000 of that original loan had been transferred out within the first month, routed through to personal accounts before disappearing into what investigators believed was gambling debt Tyler had already been carrying quietly for years, long before any of us knew there was a problem at all. My mother read that part of the report sitting at her kitchen table, and I watched her hands tremble as she set the pages down, like she was finally seeing, all at once, a version of her son that had been standing in front of her the whole time. "I used to tell people you were hard on him," she said quietly, not looking up at me. "I used to say you never understood how sensitive he was underneath it all." "Maybe I didn't understand him," I said, "but I understood numbers, Mom, and numbers don't lie the way people do." She didn't argue with that, she just nodded slowly, the way someone nods when a truth finally settles somewhere it can't be moved again. I visited him once, in the weeks before his sentencing, sitting across a plastic table from a brother I barely recognized anymore, thinner, quieter, stripped of the easy charm that used to get him out of everything. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said, and for once, I believed that part was probably true, even if it didn't. "Excuse anything that came after it, I know," I told him, "but meaning well and doing right aren't the same thing. Tyler, you're going to have a long time to think about the difference." I didn't forgive him that day. I'm still not sure I fully have, and I don't think I owe anyone a timeline on that, but I stopped carrying the weight of what he did as if it were somehow mine to carry, and that alone felt like its own kind of freedom. 6 months later, on a Thursday evening in November, I drove back to that house for Thanksgiving, the first one I'd been invited to in 8 years. I stood on that same front porch for a long moment before I knocked, the way I had the day they told me to leave, except this time the fear in my chest felt different, smaller, more like nervousness than dread. My mother opened the door before I even had to knock, and she didn't say anything at first as she just pulled me into a hug, so tight it nearly knocked the breath out of both of us. Inside, the table was set the way it always used to be, except this time there was a chair left empty on purpose, not for Tyler, but as a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement of everything that had happened to get us to this table at all. My father stood up when I walked in, something he'd never once done for me at any dinner in my entire childhood, and he pulled out the chair across from him without a word, just a small nod that said more than any speech could have. We didn't talk about the house, or the fraud case, or the 7 years of silence, not that first night. We talked about small things instead. My job, my mother's garden, the weather, ordinary conversations that felt anything but ordinary given everything underneath them. Later that night, after the dishes were cleared, my mother found me alone on the back porch, the same porch where I used to sit as a kid dreaming about a different kind of family. "I know we can't undo 7 years," she said quietly, sitting down beside me, "but I'm grateful for whatever this is now, whatever you're willing to let it be." "Me too," I said, and I meant it more than I expected to. A year passed after that first Thanksgiving, and the changes came slowly, the way real change usually does, nothing like the fast, tidy resolution you'd see in a movie. My father started calling just to talk, not about anything important, sometimes just about the weather or a game he'd watched, small ordinary conversations that would have meant nothing to me once, but now felt like tiny bricks being laid towards something new. He asked me one afternoon, almost shyly, if I'd be willing to show him how I'd found the fraud in the first place, the records, the filings, the way I'd pieced it all together, and I spent 2 hours at his kitchen table teaching my 61-year-old father how to read a property record like I once learned to read one myself. I should have asked you about things like this a long time ago, he said, staring at the screen. Instead of assuming you were just trying to cause trouble, you didn't know what you didn't know. I told him, and I meant it, even though some old, tired part of me still wished he'd learned it sooner. My mother, for her part, started sending me photos of her garden every few weeks, small unremarkable things, tomatoes ripening on the vine, a new row of marigolds along the fence, and somehow those small photos said more to me than any long apology ever could have. I still owned that house, technically, on paper, for now, and every month my parents sent their rent payment through Meridian like clockwork, slowly buying back not just a piece of property, but something more like trust. I don't know if we'll ever be the family we should have been from the start. Some wounds don't close all the way, no matter how much time passes over them, and I've made peace with that instead of forcing a happy ending that wouldn't have been honest. But I know this much for certain, I stopped needing their approval somewhere along the way, quietly, without even noticing it happen, and that turned out to be worth more than any house, any deed, or any apology ever could be. Sometimes I still drive past that house on nights I can't sleep, just to see the porch light on, my mother's shadow moving behind the curtains the way it always used to, and instead of the old ache I used to feel looking at it from the outside, I mostly just feel steady now, like a debt finally settling itself between two people who are still learning how to be a family, slowly, honestly, one ordinary Sunday at a time. If you made it this far with me, I want to say thank you, genuinely, for sitting through this story the way you did, because stories like this only mean something when someone's actually listening on the other end. If this one hit home for you in any way, hit that like button, subscribe to the Revenge Diaries so you don't miss the next one, and if you know someone who'd understand exactly what this story was really about, go ahead and send it their way, because sometimes the right story finds the right person at exactly the moment they need it. And if you're not ready to leave yet, stick around, because there's another story waiting for you right after this one. Another family, another betrayal, another quiet, patient kind of justice, and trust me, you're going to want to see how that one ends too.